on Israel and Gaza with an MP banned from the West Bank, and what the titans of AI are planning for us next. Join me after the news.
On your radio, on Global Player, and
Play LBC.
Leading Britain's conversation. This is LBC.
From Global's newsroom at 6 o'clock, Sir Keir Starmer says a free trade deal between the UK and India is the most ambitious since Brexit. But opposition parties have raised concerns it could make it cheaper for British companies to hire Indian workers. The agreement means they wouldn't have to make national insurance contributions. Deputy Leader of the Liberal Democrats, Daisy Cooper, says it's concerning.
The Labour government keeps saying that they want to get more people into work. It sounds like this new trade deal means that companies will be incentivised to hire Indian workers over British workers. So this simply doesn't add up.
The government says the deal will be worth £5 billion to the UK economy. The new Canadian Prime Minister insists Canada is not for sale during a visit to the White House. Mark Carney is meeting Donald Trump after being elected last week. Germany's Conservative leader Friedrich Merz has been elected Chancellor in a second round of voting in the country's parliament. He failed in a first ballot, which saw him fall short by 6 votes from MPs. And the country's newest MP has taken her seat in the House of Commons. Reform's Sarah Pochin won the Runcorn and Helsby by-election last week, beating Labour by 6 votes. In the city, the FTSE 100 has closed at 1 point at 85.97. The pound buys $1.33 and €1.17. LBC weather, much of the UK staying dry tonight with clear skies in western and southern areas. Cloudier for the north and east, a low of 2. From Global's newsroom for LBC, I'm Amelia Cox.
This is LBC from Global, leading Britain's conversation. It's 6 p.m. Now, Tonight with Andrew Marr.
Good evening. Should the government scrap its decision to take the winter fuel allowance away from so many pensioners? Earlier today, the Health Secretary, Wes Streeting, admitted the unpopular policy was one of the reasons for Labour getting such a battering from Reform at last week's elections. The number 10 position is still no change. But you have to ask, if the government says it's listening, if, as so many ministers say, they now really get it, Wes Streeting, I want to reassure people we have got the message, we have noticed. What could that possibly mean, except for a change in the policies that voters hate most? Yes, it's embarrassing to change course. Yes, it might even be a bit humiliating for the Chancellor, Rachel Reeves, whose policy this was. But that's democracy. People at the heart of government tell me they understand that a gap has opened up between the politics of Westminster, the elites, and ordinary voters. There are all sorts of ways our government might try to change that gap. Shifting policy, on tax, on immigration, on welfare. How you do these things, how you win back the attention and the interest of Reform voters without simply sounding like a watered-down version of Reform, in which case, why not go for the real thing, is genuinely difficult politics. And I don't want to sound like a wise guy. But one thing I do know, if the electorate smacks you hard across the chops, the thing not to do is to pretend you haven't noticed. So let's talk all of this through with the founder of Blue Labour, a man with some influence, I hope, in Downing Street, Lord Maurice Glasman, and with Jonathan Ashworth, the former Shadow Work and Pension Secretary and the Chief Executive of the think tank Labour Together. Welcome to you both. Maurice, let's start with you. There's lots to talk about, but let's start with the pensioners' fuel issue. This is something that Labour MPs tell me turned up again and again. Nigel Farage says privately this is what won him the by-election.
Yeah, I mean, it's a hugely unpopular Treasury proposal, but it just reveals a deeper issue. We could renounce it tomorrow. It wouldn't make the blindest bit of difference on our standing, because there needs to be fundamental reform of welfare state, and there's no story about it. So it's just this series of unpopular, arbitrary moves.
What would your story start with?
That the artificial intelligence opens up the real possibilities for getting rid of huge amounts of administrative jobs. That's where the savings have got to go. That the bigger the state gets, the worse it is, the more useless it becomes. So Labour's got to commit itself to restoring the integrity and effectiveness of government. That's the real story, and they're not really addressing that.
We're getting into some big issues already, but Jonathan, what's your view on the winter fuel allowance issue? Do you think it's time to just bite the bullet and get rid of it?
Yeah, so there's been reports in some of the papers today that apparently this is being now discussed in government. I hope that is true. I thought it was a mistake at the time. Look, I totally accept that a millionaire, Richard Branson, whoever, does not need the £200 or £300 at Christmas, but there must be a way of raising the threshold much higher, because it has become seen as the debut policy of this government. So I hope they can look at it again. By the way, there was a rationale for it. I mean, I was with Gordon Brown back in the day when we introduced the winter fuel allowance. In them days, the pension did not increase by the triple lock, i.e. you didn't have such hugely generous increases in the pension year by year. So that's the rationale for not needing an additional welfare top-up at Christmas. But look, it's clearly become the sort of symbolic issue of the moment, and I hope the government look at this.
And also, if they don't change, then it suggests that all this comment about we've got the message, we've heard the voters, isn't real.
But Maurice is right. You know, I mean, I do think for political reasons, you know, and for fairness reasons, you've got to look at this policy. But there is a bigger issue here. And for me, in the end, it is about a sense that the economy no longer works for working people. People feel worse off. They're skint. That it's difficult to earn a wage, which keeps it where you can build a family, you can build a home, you can do the things that provide a quality of life for you. And that's because our economy has been in a malaise now for years. I mean, I just looked at the run of figures. Like, since about 2010, or since the financial crash, the economy's grown per person by 0.5%. If it had grown at the levels pre-financial crash, you'd have 40% more money now to spend as an economy. Up to the crash under the new Labour years, it was growing at 2.3% per person. In the 90s and the sort of John Major years mainly, 2.2%. In the 80s, 2.6%. You can see the huge drop in economic growth in these last 15 years since the crash.
So this goes a long way, Maurice, to show why the country is so absolutely furious with the political class. The economy isn't growing. Trouble is, it's going to take quite a while. It's quite difficult to turn that around, and people's patience is limited.
No, if they saw strong leadership, if they saw that we were going in the right direction, and if they saw that we had the strength to do the difficult things, I don't see the problem. The thing is, Jonathan, is that all that new Labour economic stuff was city and services. We allowed our industrial economy to wither on the vine.
Well, this is post-Thatcher in the early 80s.
Completely. Yeah. So we've got a problem of the last 50 years have been completely mistaken in their assumptions about the world. Now we're living in a nation of war, a world of war, of nation states, of industrial and military power. This is what Labour's got to address.
And do you think, Keir Starmer, do you think he has got the steel, the strength, the backbone, as it were, to take these big decisions?
Well, he's the Prime Minister, and lonely lies the crown. It's a really tough job. He didn't think that the world was anything like this. He was a human rights lawyer and a public prosecutor. What did he know about this level of public hate? What did he know about Trump? What did he know about the Ukraine-Russian war? I would imagine not a lot. But now he's got to be a Prime Minister that actually is serious about the renewal of the realm, about the restoration of the integrity of the state. What we've got, Jonathan, is a loathing of the entire political class.
Oh, yeah.
Because people feel betrayed. And people aren't wrong about that. We've got to recognise that they're absolutely right about that.
I mean, you're absolutely right. Of course, people... I mean, we're in this... We're not in a period of purposeful optimism about politics, yet people expect politicians to deliver so much. So that's the sort of irony of that. But look, you're right, in as much as we've run an economy over the last sort of 30, 40 years based on services. But look, we're also got to be honest, though. We are not going back to the days where there's one big monopolistic industry in a town like Bolsover. We're not going to reopen the pits, but there is an opportunity in this new world of instability by investing in defence,
yes,
by investing in technology. But also, here's a word of caution. Biden did try all this. He spent billions and billions and billions subsidising industry, and manufacturing employment increased by 1%. That was after the Americans spending billions. So you've got to get this right.
Oh, no, completely. And it's got to be really merciless. It's got to be on the back of the defence spending. But we build factories in Bolsover, in Bolton, in Salford. People have got to see that we're capable of actually defending our borders. That links up to immigration. The whole thing's integrated. What they see is words and no action.
To get that defence spending, though, Maurice, don't we have to do this deal with the Europeans later this month? They've got 150 or 160 billion euros sitting there for their new defence fund, which we could get access to. But that will come with payoffs.
And what would the payoffs be?
The payoffs will be stabbing the fishing industry in the back, for one.
Yeah, I think the situation is much worse for Europe than for us. I really do. I think that one thing that our country does come out with honour with, and we honour the Conservatives here, as well as Keir Starmer, is that we've been resolute in our friendship for Ukraine. Alone in Europe, we've stood and we've been consistent with that. The consequence of that is really severe. We're going to have to stand with them going forward. And the rest of Europe, I've spoken to people in Scandinavia, I've spoken to people in Germany, and they understand that the UK is going to be the leader of the military response of the weapons industry. And I think we can get German investment here without doing any of those kinds of payoffs that kills the fishing industry.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's right, and I think there is an opportunity here for this Labour government when it comes to defence, and I would like to see this government go further on its commitments on defence expenditure.
Totally.
But we've got to work out how this all adds up. We are at the absolute limits of what we can borrow and what the markets will allow us to borrow, and we cannot pretend that. When it comes to the bond markets, that we can just run away from reality. We saw what happened with Liz Truss.
We can't do that.
I was going to say, I'm going to come back to both of you for a couple of other examples of specific policies that you think would help fend off reform and turn this thing around. But I'm going to bring in Aggie Chambray, LBC's political correspondent, who has been spending her day at the lobby briefing where this was discussed, and I think smoothing your way around Westminster, talking to lots of Labour MPs about what they're thinking. Aggie.
That's right, Andrew. And I think the difficult thing, you basically just heard it here, everybody has a lot of different ideas of how to fend off reform, how the government should be handling things better, whether or not they should or shouldn't ditch winter fuel allowance. I mean, Maurice Glasman suggesting there that wouldn't make all of the difference. Jonathan Ashworth perhaps suggesting that it might make quite a big difference. And that's the problem with Labour MPs I've been speaking to today. They fundamentally disagree. And the government says they get it. Keir Starmer says he gets it. He's in listening mode. But listening to who? Because there isn't necessarily one thing that they could do. Could they veer to the right? Could they veer to the left?
And going further and faster in which direction?
But in which direction? I think that's exactly it. And, you've had people, the first time, one Labour MP on the left of the party suggested to me today that they were slightly pleased about what happened as a consequence of the set of results on Thursday, because people, for the first time, lots of people were speaking out on the record, and that's something they felt hadn't really happened up to this point.
Sorry to butt in, but I'm really interested in what you're picking up about. Everyone's talking about big reshuffle, lots of people losing their jobs and changing. How has that conversation been affected by the local elections?
I think there is worry about what could happen if people like Bridget Phillipson, if people like Lucy Powell, Lisa Nandy are ejected from the cabinet, and what might happen, what they might do on the backbenches. So there is a feeling among some Labour MPs that actually they should wait as long as possible to do the reshuffle, because there are lots of these very eager, lots of them young men who aren't yet ministers, who hope that if they remain loyal for long enough, they'll become ministers. So lots of people think actually hold off on the reshuffle because those loyal young men on the backbenches actually will remain loyal.
That's very, very shrewd. Jonathan, I'm going to ask you about that because you know many of the characters involved. I mean, it must be a really dismal business being a cabinet minister and picking up the papers every day to find out you're about to be sacked.
Well, I mean, I've seen it from both sides, both as a shadow cabinet minister, not reading I'm going to be sacked, but having that sense of what's going to happen in a reshuffle hanging over you. But also when I worked for a Prime Minister and when I worked for Gordon Brown, and you have to advise Prime Ministers on, no Prime Ministers ever want to do these reshuffles, by the way. Do not, if you watch political dramas, you think they relish it. They don't. They hate doing this. But, Prime Ministers refresh their teams, and at the end of the day, the Prime Minister is the leader. It's up to them who they want in their team. But, it doesn't, if you think a reshuffle is going to solve a short-term political problem, they very rarely do. You've got to deal with the fundamentals, and basically, people are skint. We've got to raise living standards. We've got to fix things like the NHS. People want to know that there's good, well-paid jobs for their children, and those are the things the government's got to concentrate on. And by the way, I actually think in the next 3 or 4 years they can deliver on. But that's where the energies of the government have always got to be. That's what is going to give you the glide path to election victory in the future.
What do you reckon, Maurice?
Yeah, I agree with this. The thing is, we've got to get the strategic direction, and the key is post-Brexit, post-Trump, national renewal. And we've got all these opportunities. There's so many ways that we can do that. For example, renew the Commonwealth as a sphere
organisation
and invite Ukraine to join the Commonwealth, which gives them space. Military alliances that we can build today with India. I'm not going to talk about the trade deal, but what's vital is that the relationship between the UK and India is refreshed, renewed, and restored in terms of leading the Commonwealth. But above all, it's about rejecting globalisation, really with enthusiasm, laying the ghosts of Blair and Brown to rest, Jonathan.
Well, I'm a great fan of Gordon Brown.
Well, that's a problem because...
It's not a problem.
The reason it's a problem is that he was a merciless statist who loved globalisation, and the situation we've got to have now...
He took a million children out of poverty, Maurice.
Yeah, but he is so much energy.
Let's not go back to too much history and ask instead what you think needs to be done at cabinet level. Do you think there need to be big changes in people running the government?
I certainly do think there need to be big changes, but those changes have got to be based on the strategic direction of the government, not on just
personalities. So putting personalities to one side, nonetheless, who are the personalities that you think need to be changed?
Well, I'm in favour, and I've said it often, that the time has run out on the Treasury altogether, that the Treasury should be abolished. We should have an economics ministry that puts industry first. So that brings up a whole range. It's also got to be the case of the integration of foreign policy, defence policy and industrial policy has got to be at the absolute forefront of the government's thinking. And then there's the issue of energy and the environment, which is huge. Those have got to be the areas where a very clear direction is forged to renew our nation and the operation of government. Otherwise, it's over.
Climate change is real, but net zero, in the way it's being sold at the moment, isn't very popular among the voters who have left Labour.
Yeah, so, the position is clear that we really, really love nature. We want clean water. That's really what people want. They want clean air and clean water. And all this net zero targets is a delusion. There's got to be a mix of renewables, nuclear, and fossil fuels, and that's absolutely vital for industrialisation, which depends on heat. Sometimes I'm not sure if the Secretary of State knows the difference between energy and electricity, to be honest.
All right. Final word to you, Jonathan. It's been an absolute battering in the polls for you and for the Conservatives. Do you think, talking to your colleagues, that the Labour Party is prepared to make some big changes, immigration policy, industrial policy we've been talking about, in response to it?
Well, I think the Labour Party, even before these local elections, knew it had to deal with immigration, wants an industrial policy to create good, well-paid jobs. But I think there's one other thing, and Maurice just said it in his first answer, which is about a story. Very soon, we'll get the smoke, and we'll see whether we've got a new pope or not in the next few days or so, hopefully. There's a reason why thousands flock to the Vatican every Sunday to listen to an old man deliver a sermon, because people want stories, they want parables, they want something to believe in. And I would encourage my colleagues in the cabinet, my old colleagues, I'm no longer there anymore, sadly, but I would encourage them to really get this story right. And give people something to believe in.
And it's a great Labour story, but we've got to go back 45 and before to see how we did it.
Because if you sound like Reform light, people will just go for the real thing.
Well, I think so, but also bear in mind, Andrew, that Nigel Farage's Reform have nicked a load of blue Labour stuff. We were on for the nationalisation of steel, we were on for the withdrawal from the ECHL before that. This is proper Labour policy. What we've got to do is expose Farage and Reform, well, Farage in particular, as a Putin apologist and a saloon bar Thatcherite. This nationalisation stuff is totally alien to his way of viewing the world. He'd prefer Singapore to the Rhineland, I can assure you.
Well, some very good advice there, I'm sure, from the Prime Minister. Thank you all very much indeed. I would like to hear your thoughts as well. Do you think the government needs to change tack after these bruising local election results? And if so, what would you like to see them do? Text me on 84850 or email marr@lbc.co.uk. Coming up, Israel announced yesterday it wants to take all of Gaza, and one of the MPs who was denied entry to Israel last month will be with me next. But the time now, 6:19.
This is LBC. Tonight with Andrew Marr. Watch live on Global Player. This is LBC.
6:20. The situation in Gaza remains unbearably bleak. Right now I can see only the blackest of futures ahead for the Palestinians and eventually for Israel too. Yesterday, Israeli officials said they planned to seize Gaza and remain in the territory for an unspecified amount of time, although details of the plan haven't yet been formally announced. There are now perhaps only a couple of dozen Israeli hostages left alive to be discovered and released. The right-wing Israeli finance minister, Bezalel Smotrich, says that the plan is that Gaza will be entirely destroyed. Civilians will be sent to the south to a humanitarian zone without Hamas or terrorism, and from there they will start to leave in great numbers to third countries. Then it seems Israel would annex the whole territory formally. Meanwhile, the population in Gaza is desperately short of food and clean water. At the very least, we need eyes on the ground. And that's partly perhaps why there's been so much anger here in Britain at the decision by Israel to deny entry to the West Bank for two Labour MPs, Abdissam Mohammed of Sheffield Central and Yuan Yang, MP for Earley and Woodley, who joins me now. Yuan, it's very good to have you in the studio. Why do you think you were turned back?
So Abdissam and I have discussed this in the House of Commons chamber, where we had the support of so many colleagues, not just from the Labour benches, but
from all
sides.
Yes.
And we're very grateful for the support of the government, from the Prime Minister himself down to the Foreign Secretary and the Middle East Minister. I think what's really important now, I think, is to focus on the situation in Gaza, as you described. It is unbearably bleak, and our government has been really clear that we would not support any further extension of the occupation that's going on.
Apart from anything else, as it were, just annexing Gaza would be against international law, wouldn't it?
It would, absolutely.
And what about the condition so far? I mean, you haven't been able to get into any of the parts of the area, but as you understand it, of the people left behind, because we're told that food is now running out properly and that clean water is running out and that people are in the danger of famine is real.
Yes, and the Middle East Minister has spoken before about witnessing with his own eyes the blockage of aid trucks going into Gaza. So I think that's a real cause for concern. And on the point that you mentioned about seeing the situation on the ground, I think it's really important to preserve cross-parliamentary dialogue and visits between the UK and Israel.
Let's turn back to a bit of domestic stuff, because you've got a background as an economist and a journalist. You know about these things. The country is clearly very, very angry. They were angry with the Conservatives. They're now just as angry with Labour. From your perspective, what can be done in the short term and then in the long term to quell some of the anger against your party?
So I was canvassing in Runcorn in the by-election there. I canvassed in the west of England a mayoral election, which we held with several thousand votes. We don't have local elections on the large scale in Berkshire, in my own seat in Reading. But what I did see and what I heard from voters on the doorstep in Runcorn in the west of England was really needing to see faster progress on the cost of living. And I spoke to voters who'd voted in Runcorn, voted Labour for a large part of their lives, who then said, well, at the end of the month, we simply don't have enough money left over.
So it really is money in pocket.
I really think it is that. And for many voters, whether that's about utility bills going up in April, as we saw, the cost of energy, the cost of electricity and water and so on, I think for many voters that all comes together, regardless of whether it's a kind of off-what regulatory decision, regardless of how much government has to say for that, they all count it together.
They don't really care who's responsible. They just notice the lack of money. Was the winter fuel issue something you picked up on the doorstep a lot? That
did come up on the doorstep as well, and I'd really hope that as the government is doing it, it's listening to the voters and the message that they've sent, and also I hope they'll also be listening to the field organisers and really listening to what's happening on the ground.
So it might be a little bit embarrassing to do it, but do you think that they should reverse the policy on the winter fuel allowance? I'm asking every Labour Party person I can talk to at the moment about this.
Sure. Well, I've said that in my own seat on the doorstep when I speak to voters about the winter fuel payment policy. There are many rich pensioners who will say there is a moral case that we don't pay this as a completely kind of blanket benefit to everyone. I do think there's a concern for those pensioners who are just at the pension credit limit. I do think that that's the 12,000 a year is not very much to live on. But I think the more important increase to pensioners' livelihoods under our government is the increase that all pensioners have seen from the triple lock, which the opposition are planning to scrap. So
it sounds to me as if you'd be in favour of tweaking it rather than reversing it.
I think it's the pension credit threshold. I think that is the more important issue. I don't think that it's right to give a non-means tested benefit to all pensioners, but I think there are pensioners who are struggling out there.
And what's the mood among your colleagues at the moment? You've all come back to Parliament today. It has been a bruising week last week.
Well, I have to say, I barely have seen them because it's as it was a bank holiday yesterday, so we've just gotten into Parliament today. I think there'll be a lot of discussion among different regional groups about what happened across all of our different areas. I think what unites areas like mine in Reading and Earley and Woodley and areas in the west of England and in the north of England in traditional red wall seats, though, is a general feeling that wherever you are on the income scale, whether you're middle class, whether you're working class, I think that a lot of people feel like they don't have enough left over at the end of the month, and that it's difficult to make a living. It's a
long-term, tough thing to turn round. But for now, Yuan Yang, thank you very much indeed for coming in and talking to me. Right, finally, at last, face to face. Mark Carney, the newly elected Prime Minister of Canada, has been visiting President Trump in the White House this afternoon, after a campaign in which he excoriated the US president for suggesting he wanted to make Canada America's 51st state. The two men were finally nose to nose. So, how did it go? Here is Trump talking about his dream of the 51st state.
I believe it would be a massive tax cut for the Canadian citizens. You get free military, you get tremendous medical cares and other things. There would be a lot of advantages, but it would be a massive tax cut. And it's also a beautiful, as a real estate developer, I'm a real estate developer at heart. When you get rid of that artificially drawn line, somebody drew that line many years ago with like a ruler, just a straight line right across the top of the country. When you look at that beautiful formation when it's together, I'm a very artistic person. But when I looked at that beauty, I said, that's the way it was meant to be.
As you know from real estate, there are some places that are never for sale.
That's true.
We're sitting in one right now, Buckingham Palace that you visited as well.
That's true.
And having met with the owners of Canada over the course of the campaign last several months, it's not for sale, won't be for sale ever. But the opportunity is in the partnership and what we can build together. And we have done that in the past. And part of that, as the president just said, is with respect to our own security.
Well, our Washington correspondent, Simon Marks, has been monitoring this extraordinary meeting. Simon, this was surreal beyond belief, wasn't it?
Absolutely surreal, Andrew. For 33 minutes, Donald Trump kept the made-for-TV show going, and you could see Mark Carney and the other members of his delegation absolutely itching to put it behind them so that they could get on with the serious, substantive conversation that the Canadians want to have with the US government about the future of Donald Trump's trade war and his tariffs. Time and again, after Mark Carney initially shut down the idea of Canada becoming America's 51st state, Donald Trump kept going back to the issue, kept being shut down by Mark Carney. At one point, a Canadian reporter in the room asked President Trump what concession he was looking for from Canada, to which he answered simply and rather confusingly, friendship. The reporter pointed out that friendship didn't feel like a concession. Surely friendship actually existed. That led to a riff about the importance of friendship between the two countries by the US leader. And the president was also asked whether there was anything that Mark Carney could do today that would result in the immediate alleviation of Canada's tariff burdens. And that reporter was told flatly by Donald Trump, Absolutely not. It is what it is. Every indication that he is digging into a much more hostile relationship with Canada. The way was paved for that 24 hours ago by his own Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick, who was raging on the Fox Business Network about Canada's socialist governing tradition, even suggesting that the future of the US-Mexico-Canada free trade agreement is in doubt, and the president breathed his own air into that argument during the course of that meeting today. So after 33 minutes, they finally went behind closed doors. They're having lunch together at the White House. There is no joint press conference scheduled on this occasion between the two leaders. But again, the notion that the Canadian Prime Minister was being put through this reality TV hazing when all he wanted to do was go and get on with the business of diplomacy was agonising to watch.
So, Simon, just bring people up to date on where we actually are in terms of this trade war between the US and Canada, because during the election of Mark Carney, there was lots of fierce words were said, and before that, parts of Canada had imposed their own tariffs and threatened to jack up the price of energy and much else. Where are we now?
Yeah, well, absolutely. And the fierce words continued. I mean, even while Mark Carney was preparing to head to the White House this morning, Donald Trump took to his social media account and insisted the United States needs nothing from Canada, an opinion that he voiced again with the Prime Minister flanked alongside him. President Trump insisting that discovered when the Premier of Ontario threatened to cut energy exports to the United States, a move that, had he followed through on it, would have left major parts of the northeast of the United States without power, literally in the dark. But this is what Mark Carney, now Prime Minister, is having to deal with.
So it is perfectly possible that this is going to get much uglier before it gets any better. I wonder if at some point somebody is going to lean across in the Oval Office and hand President Trump a copy of Adam Smith's The Wealth of Nations.
Well, the person most likely to do that is his Treasury Secretary, Scott Bessent, who, while this meeting was taking place at the White House today, was giving testimony on Capitol Hill and was stumbling in attempting to justify the trade war to members of Congress. He also pulled the rug out from his own president because, under oath, remember, he testified that there were no negotiations taking place between the United States and China. And President Trump has repeatedly in recent days indicated that direct talks were underway between those two countries, despite the fact that China has denied it. So Donald Trump found out by that event up on Capitol Hill this morning, even as he was preparing to sit down with Canada's new leader.
Well, the way things are going, it seems to me that American politics needs a kind of global translator. And I think you're doing a very, very good job indeed, Simon. Thanks so much. Now then, coming up, the UK and India have just signed the biggest trade deal since Brexit. This seems, on the face of it, like good news, but is it perhaps too good to be true? The time now, 6:33, and Amelia Cox has the news headlines.
Opposition parties fear a free trade deal between the UK and India could undercut British workers. The agreement means British businesses won't have to make national insurance contributions for Indian employees. Germany's Conservative Party leader has been elected Chancellor following a second vote in the country's parliament. Friedrich Merz missed out in a first ballot after a number of MPs dissented. And Jonathan Ashworth has told LBC he hopes the government does give in to pressure to reverse cuts to winter fuel payments. Speaking on Tonight with Andrew Marr, the former Work and Pension Secretary says it needs to be southern areas, cloudier for the north and east, a low of 2 degrees.
LBC This Morning on Nick Ferrari at Breakfast.
The lack of knowledge is quite incredible, and how important is it that the upcoming generation, know exactly what's going on? Only a third know what happened on VE Day. 66% haven't got a clue what the Battle of Britain is. Only around 33% knew who the Prime Minister was during the war. Professor Sir Hugh Strawn is leading military historian, Emeritus Fellow at All Souls College in Oxford, and Professor of International Relations at the University of St Andrews.
In 2014, we were staggered just how ignorant people were about the First World War. But when we get to 2039, we'll begin that process of commemoration again. And my guess is there'll be a fair amount of public education going on through that.
Nick Ferrari at Breakfast. Back tomorrow morning from 7. Listen on your radio and on Global Player, LBC. This is LBC. Message Andrew Marr on WhatsApp now on 0345 60 60 973.
6:36. Right, so here is a piece of genuinely good news for once. At least I think it is. The government has signed a £4.8 billion trade deal with India, which ought to give us some relief from the trade war unleashed on us by Donald Trump. The Indian deal will sharply cut tariffs on products we sell there, such as foods and whiskey, medical devices and cars, and it should make some clothes and footwear and food products from India cheaper here. The negotiators hope it'll boost trade between the two countries by more than £25 billion and push up British wages by more than £2 billion a year in the long run. This was a deal which started under the Conservatives and Boris Johnson as part of their post-Brexit reset, but which was said to be stalled then because of worries about increased numbers of visas, which the Indian side wanted. Let's begin with an Indian perspective with the country's High Commissioner in London, Vikram Doraiswamy. When we spoke a little bit earlier, I began by asking him what Indian products British consumers would notice as cheaper in the future.
Well, areas of interest for us in goods traditionally revolved around products that we've been exporting to the UK, but we are comparatively less competitive in terms of price because of the remaining stretch of tariffs, etc. These include garments, footwear, food products, including frozen prawns, electronic and electrical items, components, cars, etc. So it enables us to increase our trade share there, but more importantly, it also enables greater integration of value chains of production, particularly around electricals, electronics, and automotive sectors.
Yes, a lot has been made of cutting the tariffs for British exports into India around whiskey in particular, but also cars. Do you think this is one of those areas where, because of the Trump tariffs, the British car industry might see a bit of relief?
Well, look, I mean, to be honest, this was already being negotiated for some time. So the contours of some of these things we have known, obviously, internally for some time. So I wouldn't necessarily see cause and effect in that. But yes, to your point about whether it will benefit the industry, certainly. We are very keen, particularly for our consumers of high-end cars, to be able to access UK's Jaguar Land Rover and Mini and other such high-quality cars at better prices.
Well, that's very good to hear. These negotiations, as you say, have been going on for a long time. I think started originally under Boris Johnson. A sticking point during the Conservative years was the suggestion that India wanted a lot more visas for the UK in return, and the Conservative government wouldn't give that. So what's changed? How was this able to be done so quickly?
Look, I mean, the reality is I've been saying this, clearly, obviously my English needs work because it hasn't been understood in this country for sure. We've been saying this repeatedly. The trade agreement was never about visas, not in the Conservative period, not in the current period. We are a large and reasonably sophisticated economy. We're not looking to be sending people here purely for as part of an FTA. And that was never an ask. I think the current Secretary of State made that clear in an interview in India. My minister made that clear in India. We made that clear with the previous government also. So the reality was, of course, sometimes things come together when everybody agrees that the glass is full enough, that some of the things that we might still want to get out of it maybe require a little more effort. But I think the context now is such that it made sense for us to bag as many of our gains as possible on both sides and to move ahead. So just to be clear, the visas were never part of it.
Heard loud and clear now, anyway, High Commissioner. Nonetheless, you know, this has been going on for a long time and the negotiation has been concluded quite quickly. So to put it perhaps crudely or brutally, what has the Labour government been able to give you that the Conservative government did not or could not?
To be honest, look, the deal was pretty much, to be fair to say, I would say about 90+% ready before the election. I think the Labour government came to power and in July last year. They took several months for their own internal consultation on this and other elements of other free trade agreements that were on negotiation. And I think they brought with them the conviction that it was worth just getting this done quickly. I mean no disrespect to the previous government or to say one has done better than the other. It is context that matters. Really, I think we were at the lip of an election in both countries last summer. It would not have been possible, I think, to go beyond what we had reached. Both governments did their best. But I think, of course, they've certainly brought a very practical approach to it. To be fair, I think the British side in the last few months has said, look, let's just focus on what's in front of us. We think these are good things. Can we make the deal a little better? Both sides stretched a little bit further, made that work. And I think the two prime ministers took the decision that this is good. Let's just go ahead.
And you say context matters. Surely the context of the Trump tariff war around the world has to be part of this. It must make countries who can do good trade together want to do so more.
Let's just say the world is a slightly different place than it was last summer.
Absolutely. High Commissioner, thank you very, very much indeed.
Thank you for having me on.
Now, you heard him say there, visas were never part of this. But since I did that interview, more details of what the Indian side has been saying in India have emerged. The Prime Minister, Mr. Narendra Modi, talks about a huge social security win, which will mean that national insurance contributions for Indian workers here in the UK are exempted for 3 years, giving them a clear advantage over British workers. Tories here point out that Indian officials call it an unprecedented achievement, which will make Indian service providers significantly more competitive in the UK. In other words, they will be cheaper than British workers. Price worth paying? Our political correspondent, Aggie Chambray, is here to tell us more. Aggie, when we first saw this deal come out, it seemed like an absolutely brilliant win for the government, a big boost to the economy, and it probably still is. But the issue of Indian workers undercutting British workers as a result of national insurance changes is beginning to get some political traction, isn't it?
I think that's right, Andrew. So when this was first announced earlier today, after more than a dozen rounds of talks, and the last of those talks happening just last week, I think everybody thought this was actually just a total win. This was something that was being negotiated since 2022 when the Conservatives were in charge. But actually now, as you say, it transpires there's a convention within this deal that Indian workers coming to the UK, UK workers going to India will not have to pay social security contributions for 3 years. Now, this is especially controversial, at least today, because of the increase in national insurance for employers here. So, this has resulted in essentially a bit of a war of words between the Conservatives.
A lot of stuff online. I've seen lots of Tory MPs and Conservative commentators piling in on this, and I think the papers tomorrow will be full of it.
I think that's right, and Kemi Badenoch is now saying that this was a deal that she could have signed and chose not to because she saw it as inadequate. And now, the story is becoming more about this controversial part of the deal as opposed to Labour able to get a deal over the line that the Conservatives only part had. And Nigel Farage too has weighed in. He's described the deal as truly appalling. And this felt like it could just be a solid win for the government in a few days where they haven't had a huge number of solid wins. But as with everything in politics, it's now become a bit of a football.
Somehow the wind is against them at the moment, almost whatever they do. But we should remind people, this is a big deal. It's to be good for British car makers. We heard the High Commissioner there saying, we want Land Rovers, we want Jaguars, we want some of your high-end cars. Those are the ones that the Americans would have taken, presumably. And consumers will see cheaper shoes, cheaper clothes.
Indeed. And, ministers are saying that this could add almost £5 billion, £4.8 billion to the economy by 2040. That is absolutely not to be sniffed at, especially in this economy. It's expected this will help with tariffs and industries affected by tariffs coming from the UK. It will help with Scotch whisky, car and other exports too. So, this is fundamentally, hopefully, a brilliant thing for the economy and should help, help with high tariffs on Scotch whisky and on. But fundamentally, I think there is this political sticking point about what this actually could look like in practice and whether British workers are going to be undercut.
Absolutely. Aggie Chambray for now. Thank you very much indeed. We're going to hear more about this. We're going to hear from the Minister for Trade, indeed, on that Indian trade deal we've just been discussing. By the time now, 6:46.
Coming up at 7, Iain Dale leading Britain's conversation. Next on LBC.
Apply.
Tonight with Andrew Marr. Listen on your smart speaker. Just say, play LBC.
6:48. And now, as promised, let's speak to Douglas Alexander, the Minister for Trade, about the trade deal between the UK and India confirmed earlier today. Douglas, a very big deal, very good news in some respects, but there is growing anxiety about the national insurance deal that seems to be alongside that. Indian workers in the UK will not have to pay, and employers will not have to pay national insurance as everybody else does. That means that they will undercut British workers, and that is causing, as you know already, absolute furore.
OK, so let me come to the Double Contribution Convention in a second. But given I'm sitting here with two fellow Scots, it's right to recognise quite what a big deal this is. When you see whisky tariffs cut from 150%, then to 70%, then to 40% in the world's largest market for whisky, this is a very big economic deal between the fifth and the sixth largest economies in the world. You're right to recognise that a feature of this deal is the Double Contribution Convention, which recognises that for Indian workers who are employed by Indian companies in India, who are working on a temporary basis in the UK, this arrangement has been put in place.
We already say temporary, Douglas, but it's 3 years.
We have arrangements already in place with the United States. We already have arrangements in place with the European Union in terms of social security. And there is, if you like, a distinction that should be drawn, first of all, between intercompany transfers, which is often highly skilled workers who are choosing to come over with the company, and the ability to bring in people for a very short period, which means that the overall numbers of immigration are not judged to be likely to be affected.
What about the VAT implications?
Those have been factored in terms...
And the Home Office is saying they don't understand...
Do you mean VAT or national insurance? Which do you mean?
I mean national insurance, sorry.
Yes. Well, the Treasury has been fully appraised of these negotiations, and in that sense, they are part of the negotiations. We had Rachel Reeves engaged in the last couple of weeks, and their clear judgment is a deal that yields about £4.8 billion extra UK GDP per year in the long term is unequivocally in the UK's national interest. This is a deal, incidentally, that the Conservatives were desperate to get over the line in recent years.
They say the reason they didn't was this taxation issue around workers, and that it really undercuts British workers.
But that's also the explanation they give for not having done the trade deal with the United States. Remember, they tried to do a trade deal with Donald Trump. They're world class at claiming we almost did a deal, but we were holding out, when actually they weren't doing deals. The reality is, if you look at the provision the Indians have in place with other countries, they often have arrangements for 5 years, not the 3 years that have been negotiated by the United Kingdom.
But you can see, in the context of an economy here, which is pretty much flatlining, and people are very, very worried about their own jobs, the prospect of being undercut by another group of workers is causing genuine anger. Including among Labour MPs.
So if you were in the Lagavulin distillery or the Glenkinchie distillery in Scotland tonight, you would be thinking, actually, having access to the largest market for whisky in the world with significantly reduced tariffs admittedly in a global trading context where barriers are going up rather than going down, would be very good news, not just for your company, but for the workers in that company. If you look at the kind of comments that we've seen today, not just from the Scottish Whisky Association, but also from the City of London, this is unequivocally good news for UK PLC.
And you would say to people who say, look, this is an unfair deal for workers who are going to be priced out by Indian workers not paying the same amount of tax. It's a price worth paying.
Well, the Indian workers are going to be making a contribution to their social security system within India, which is why it's called the Double Contribution Convention, because the Indians were arguing that as well as paying national insurance in the UK, they were also legally obliged to be paying national insurance equivalent contributions within India. But the reality is that was a matter of negotiation where we believe that we've struck the right deal for the United Kingdom, and frankly, being in opposition is immiserating. They've got to have something to say. They've alighted on this, but the reality is this is a deal they were desperate to do.
Being in the Home Office is immiserating at the moment because they didn't know about this, and they feel they've been blindsided.
Well, there are cross-Whitehall processes, as you're fully aware. It doesn't happen by chance.
Which perhaps haven't worked.
It doesn't happen by chance that the Prime Minister and Prime Minister Modi had a call today. This has been a negotiation which has involved challenging, difficult, but important conversations across Whitehall for many months. I can attest to that.
So the Home Secretary didn't know, which is a bit weird, isn't it?
Well, when you say the Home Secretary didn't know...
This is what's being reported at the moment.
Honestly, I don't know. What I can assure you in terms of what's being reported, because I come straight from the Chamber, what I can assure you is our colleagues in the Home Office have been part of that cross-Whitehall effort because, of course, there are all numbers of interests, whether that's DEFRA, whether that's the Home Office, whether that's the Treasury, whether that is DBT itself.
Final question, how much of the timing of this is down to the fact that Trump has launched his trade war around the world? In other words, is this part of us trying to protect ourselves against some of the effects of what Trump is doing?
This deal really accelerated after February when Jonathan Reynolds visited with Minister Goyal in India. And even very seasoned officials in the Department of Business and Trade were struck by the openness and the willingness of Minister Goyal to move these negotiations forward at pace at that point. It won't have passed anyone's notice that at that point by February, the global context was changing rapidly.
One domestic issue, you will not be surprised here, we're asking everybody we can about the winter fuel payment cuts. Labour MPs we talked to, from every part of the party, in every part of England who've been campaigning last week, say they came up again and again and again, and people at the top of Reform are saying, this is why we won the by-election. Is it not time to rethink this policy?
So I was campaigning in Runcorn on Thursday, I was campaigning in Hamilton on Friday. I've had a veritable by-election odyssey in the last few days. And yes, honestly, it was an issue that was raised on the doorstep in both of those by-elections.
So we're in a slightly do something about it.
Well, we're in a different position in Scotland, where Anass Sarwar, the Scottish leader, has already said he will reverse that change because the benefit is devolved in Scotland. I think the idea that on the Monday after the by-election, I've just left another studio where I was, where the Prime Minister was being challenged for having said we are listening and not yet having changed the policy, I don't think reflects the reality that when you're on these doorsteps, you hear a litany of different concerns. It's right to say that we're listening, it's right to give consideration to it, and it's right also to place on record the other steps that we're taking to support pensioners.
But to say we get it, we're listening, we've heard the message, and they're not change anything would also be frankly pretty affronting to an awful lot of voters. So even if it doesn't happen today or this week or even next week, at some point, surely if so many voters are so angry about such a policy, they are going to Reform and Nigel Farage in those numbers, you as a party have to do something about it.
I think it's reasonable for the Prime Minister to say we're listening and we get it, as you would expect after what was a horrendously close by-election in Runcorn and some pretty tough results in English council elections elsewhere. I don't think the right way to make policy is to step up on the Monday, the next week that you're back in Parliament, and suddenly change
Tuesday.
Oh, sorry, forgive me. It feels like Monday. Your approach, and we've been working all weekend, your approach to social security or anything else, I think it's right in a calm, considered, cool-headed manner to reflect more broadly on where the government finds itself. How do we rise to the challenge of meeting that hunger for change that you're right to recognise was pretty strong on the doorsteps, both in Runcorn and certainly in Hamilton?
I can't really argue with that. Douglas Alexander, thanks very much indeed for coming in. Now, later this week, the London Defence Conference gets going. It's a meeting of lots of defence analysts, politicians and military leaders to discuss the threats against us all. Its organiser, Iain Martin, says that the 80th anniversary of VE Day, marking the end of the Second World War in Europe, provides a timely platform to reflect on the importance of unity in safeguarding peace and stability. This year's theme is alliances, which sounds both timely and perhaps a bit provocative given what's going on inside NATO at the moment. So what can we expect? Iain Martin joins me now. Iain, this is going to be quite tense, some of this discussion about alliances right now.
Some people have said that it should be alliances with a question mark, but we still think that alliances matter. Yeah, we founded the conference about 3 years ago to increase the salience and interest in defence because we're a group of people who believe that defence is only going to become a bigger issue, and that essentially the long years of peace or the post-Cold War settlement are over, and that actually we're going to have to just spend as a society a bigger proportion of national income every year on defence over the next 10, 20, 30 years. And the threats are rising, whether it's CRINC, China, Russia, Iran, North Korea cooperating together, and there are obviously splits on the West. I mean, that's one of the themes that we'll discuss. We do have a large American delegation arriving on Friday, and we have all sorts of people coming in from around the world. And we have a conversation for 2 days with some of the world's leading experts on defence. And the UK is very heavily involved in the discussion.
That should be fascinating. There seem to be two really, really important issues right at the moment as we wait for our own strategic defence review to be published. One is whether we can get access to the European defence budget, this extra 150 billion euros they want to spend on defence, because that would be very important for British defence companies like that.
And the government's very keen on that.
Very keen to, so we'll see what happens on that quite shortly. But the other thing is what really the Americans think about NATO and its future going forward. Trump seems to change his mind every second day. Have you got people coming over who have real insight and access to what's going on inside the administration?
Absolutely, yes. And I think you've put your finger on the big question there, really. And I think Europe has to almost prepare for the worst and hope for the best, and develop more of its own capacity, so that as America draws down, ignore Trump's rhetoric, this is just naturally going to happen over the next 10, 20 years. America is going to do less in Europe, and European governments and societies are going to have to do more. We're all going to have to get used to this idea that we're spending more. And it's not just a blip. This doesn't finish if there is some kind of uneasy peace in Ukraine. The threats, whether that's cyber, undersea cables, what's happening in the high north, the entire sort of panoply of threats, which is much more complex than is often presented. All of that race in technology to stay ahead, we're going to have to spend more wisely, and it's going to be very difficult for governments, of course, because the public doesn't necessarily want to spend that money.
I wish it wasn't the case that the London Defence Conference had never been more timely, but it is. Iain Martin, thank you very much indeed. I'll be back with you tomorrow. If you miss any of today's show, you can listen back on Catch Up on Global Player, where you can also pause and rewind live radio, as well as listen to a range of podcasts. Download now for free from your app store or head to globalplayer.com. Coming up at 10 on LBC Ben Kentish, but right now it's time for Ian Dale.
Thank you very much, Andrew. No one watching the VE Day commemorations yesterday can fail to have been moved by the interviews with veterans who ensured that we enjoy the freedoms we have today and frankly take for granted. In this hour, we're going to talk to Colin Bell DFC, who was a fighter pilot during World War II and at the age of 104 spends his life informing and educating younger generations about the war and the role played by people like him. For the first time in a century of UK radio, a 104-year-old will be taking calls for an hour-long phone-in. Then on Cross Question, human rights campaigner Peter Tatchell, former Mayor Andy Preston, Lib Dem MP Sarah Olney and former Tory MP Laura Farris.
On your radio, on Global Player and
Play LBC.
Leading Britain's conversation.